instead of talking generally about Risk Management 101, I focus specifically on risk appetite. So that's what I'll be taking you today in the context of, I guess, the innovation agenda, or risk and innovation. Now, the reason I'm focusing on that is I can recall very clearly, still to this day, an IPA forum that was run in the 2000s when I was here at Victorian Auditor-General's office as an Assistant Auditor-General. And I'm pretty sure it was facilitated by Fran Thorne. And those of you who know Fran, she didn't really hold the office in high regard then. I hope she does hold us in better regard now. But the theme of the presentation at IPA was something along the lines of, the Auditor-General, the enemy of innovation. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you this morning trying to dispel some myths about the role of the Audit Office and our approach to innovation. And as I said, particularly talk to you about our approach to risk appetite. And I hope by sharing this with you, it might stimulate some debate and discussion in your own audit committees about how risk appetite is set and the risk culture. So I'll start very briefly with some frameworks. Now, obviously, not all of you are state government, but for those of you who are state government public sector employees or on audit committees assisting public sector entities, you have the Victorian Government Risk Management Framework, and that's been updated and be rolled out with effect. The update will be rolled out with effect from 1 July 2021. It's not a long document, but I think it gives some really good high-level insights into how to apply risk management in any organisation. And I note particularly it requires risk appetite to be defined. And I was talking to a newly minted audit committee chair a few weeks ago, and one of the other things that came up in the conversation was trying to discern the role of the audit committee in all this. And I think that audit committee chair was a bit concerned in the departmental context that there was a view that the audit committee were the ones who were managing risk in the organisation, and quite clearly that's not the case. And the VGR-MF makes that quite clear, I think, in terms of reviewing and assessing, reviewing and monitoring, and reviewing and providing oversight. So I'd encourage you to be talking with the responsible officers in your organisations, particularly those that don't have a board, and therefore the audit committee is generally made up of independent members who are not part of the organisation. I'd be encouraging you as audit committee members and the audit committee chair to have a very clear discussion with the secretary or the chief executive officer of that agency to establish your role and your responsibilities vis-a-vis their roles and their responsibilities. And as I said, you can refer back to the VGR-MF. You can also refer to broader statements of internal control, and I've always mentioned every opportunity I get, I seem to talk about the COSO framework, which is an internationally recognised control framework, and that clearly specifies that it's the role of those charged with governance in an organisation to establish and maintain effective risk management. So I'm not going to labour the roles. I think that's not the issue. What I said I wanted to focus on today was a discussion about risk appetite and culture, and hopefully through that give you some insights into our approach when we audit, because we don't want to be a part of the problem, we want to be a part of the solution. But before I dive too far into that, I guess there's a few concepts we all need to be clear on. So I'll start with this concept of public value. Now, this quote here comes from the framework. Effective risk management protects and creates value. Now, what does public value mean? Well, look, public value can mean anything, really. I mean, this diagram I've got up for you is a model, and as an economist, and of course people talk about economics as the dismal science. As an economist, we're quite keen to establish models, but the critique of these models is they don't really represent the real world in any quantitative sense. They're really just there to be illustrative. And so I haven't really tried to label, what would you define public value to be. I know that Mark Moore from the Kennedy School of Government, for those of you who've been involved in the ANZOG program and are aware of Mark Moore's work, would talk about the value that an organisation contributes to society. And I think that's enough. If you want to think about that in terms of the outcomes or the outputs produced, in terms of the cost of inputs, as we might, if you want to monetise public value, that's fine. But really what this chart is trying to say to you is that in the public sector, we deliver public value, and then in the context of risk management, there's a risk that we can destroy public value. We can erode public value. So the minuses here are about erosion of public value. So where does risk and risk appetite come into this? Well, risk appetite is defined also in the framework. The type and amount of risk an agency is prepared to accept. That sounds pretty straightforward. We typically use the level of risk to calibrate our risk appetite. This is certainly what we do in VARGO. And the level of risk, as you are, I'm sure, very aware, is just really a function of likelihood and consequence. Likelihood and consequence both inherently and then after you consider risk treatments. And we all know that likelihood has got to be calibrated in terms of a time frame. So typically we're trying to calibrate likelihood over our planning horizon. If it's an operational risk, the next 12 months. If it's strategic risk, the next 4 years, for example. And it's a truism, of course, that something that is unlikely in an arbitrarily short time frame may be almost certain in an arbitrarily long time frame. You know, we have the example of the 1 in 100 year flood or bushfire events, and typically that gives us a likelihood of occurrence of 1% every year. And maybe a little bit counterintuitively, but quite interestingly, I looked at this from a statistical lens. Over a 100-year period, it gives you about a 67% risk of occurrence rather than what you might think an absolute risk of occurrence. But that's an aside. We define risk levels in that sense, and then we use the risk level to basically set our risk appetite. So the diagram here talks about a low risk level, negligible risk, right up to a catastrophic risk level, which is really basically this thing's almost certain to happen, and when it does happen, it's going to have extreme consequences. And so conceptually, we would be eroding a huge amount of public value if a catastrophic risk occurred. So that's the concept in the framework. How does the public sector typically in the risk level? What we normally do is we try to reduce our risk appetite by reducing the risk level, or if you like, reduce the risk level to calibrate with our risk appetite. Now, I like this model up in terms of what I call protecting value. So we talked about in the framework, you know, we're there to either protect or create value. This is typically how we seem to approach risk management in the public sector. We have a level of value we're delivering, and we're there to try and protect and maintain that value. So we adopt our risk treatments to maintain the desired or current state, or sometimes I call it the steady state model, the business as usual model. We have services we're delivering, we want to make sure we deliver them. Then it's a question of, well, in the delivery of those services, how much risk are you prepared to take? And quite often, organisations their risk depending on their risk appetite depending on the nature of the risk. So again, in the context of my own organisation, we have a very low risk appetite for non-compliance with our Audit Act. In fact, we have a zero risk appetite for non-compliance with our Audit Act. But it's not the same for every risk or risk event. So I think what we need to be talking about, and when you're on an audit committee and you're trying to understand and oversight the risk culture of an organisation, we really need to bring into it another part of the equation, which is the potential to create public value. And this is the other side. You know, yes, if a risk, a condition or an event occurs, it could erode public value, but of course there are risks, there are events and conditions that occur that actually create public value. So there's an upside and a downside. And again, I just caution, I'm not trying to be quantitative here and measure this. This is really just illustrative, but it gives you a sense that, you know, we've only really thought about the loss. We've never really thought about the gain. And again, from the framework, it talks about risk-reward trade-offs. So how can you have a conversation with the executive about risk-reward trade-off? Well, you know, in a very simplistic way, here's kind of 2 units balanced against 1 unit of gain. So really, I've got a net loss potential, which was exactly the same as the net loss I had at a lower level of risk. And of course, then it's a matter of then calibrating. Now, of course, these units aren't measurable things. This is just, as I said, conceptual. But you can see there might come a point where your units of loss outweigh units of gain, and probably gone a little bit too far in the context of setting your risk appetite in relation to that particular issue. So in all things balance, but I think that's the conversation we need to be having with the organisation that we're oversighting in terms of an audit committee, and I certainly think my auditors need to be looking at that. They need to be looking at it in terms of the objectives of the organisation. Is the organisation's objectives about maintaining public value, or is it about growing public value? And if we're looking at a particular topic, issue, whether it's financial or performance, that's an important context for us, because I think we should acknowledge that there's a higher risk particularly when you're innovating and trying to grow public value. So I think they're the types of conversations I'd want you to be having with the executive and with the auditors for that matter. And if we really want to be driving an innovation agenda in Victoria and in our organisations, I think I've given you some questions here that you might want to ask those charged with governance. And they're fairly self-explanatory, but have we actually expressed our objectives and intended outcomes? That's a kind of a given, but do they include an innovation agenda? Because that then becomes the context for the risk appetite you're prepared to take in relation to where you're innovating. Some of the really important questions I think you can ask that go to culture is what support is given by management when things go wrong. Is this a learning organisation, or is this an organisation that punishes errors, even if they're done in the context of trying to innovate and grow public value? Are the risks where they're best placed to be managed? How are staff encouraged to report bad news, etc., etc.? So I'll leave it there. As I said, the purpose of our presentations today are really to stimulate some debate and some conversations around the different topics, and this one's obviously about risk management. So I'm happy now to take any questions that may have come up during my presentation. I'm looking through the live event. Would you agree that the catastrophic risk impact should align? Sorry, I was just looking at one and it disappeared for me. Would you agree that the catastrophic risk impact should align to your risk appetite? Yeah, well, I think catastrophic risk comes to setting the risk level. Now, I think it would be quite hard, even in an innovation agenda, to argue that it's acceptable for a catastrophic risk to occur. So I think you must, the two are interrelated, absolutely. If it were the case that an organisation was putting the argument that they were prepared to accept a catastrophic risk because the gain or the potential upside was so high, I'd probably walk up to that a little bit cautiously, because the consequences of the gain versus the consequences of the loss probably don't balance themselves out evenly, particularly when we look at catastrophic risks. We're really talking about things like death, significant destruction of property, information technology, things that actually stop us from delivering any public value. So I think I agree with the sentiment of that person. There's a question here that some audit committees' roles include the approval of grant money to facilitate new technologies, joint innovation projects, or supporting the role out of government policy. This requires the committee to take a broader risk appetite in approving these grants. So this is an observation. It requires at times us to take on different types of appetite. I agree with that. I think risk appetite is not a one-size-fits-all thing. I think risk appetite is absolutely contextual. And again, from an audit perspective, what we're looking for is how well articulated this risk appetite is. After the event, we can kind of ex post rationalise that, we were trying to be innovative here, and therefore, we accepted that there'd be some loss or some potential misuse. It'd be good to see that articulated up front. And, what we do in our own organisation is we try to put some, I guess, what you'd call stop loss procedures in place. We have an approach, and we're talking more and more about it these days, about setting aside some risk capital within the business, which is really money we want to invest in innovation. And that, of course, provides a natural limit, because you're setting a limit on how much money you're prepared to invest or what resources you're prepared to put into innovation vis-a-vis business as usual. And then we really talk seriously about having off-ramps and, checking in. And if risks are starting to emerge and it looks like we're not going to achieve the value, then we'd pull the project. So I think that's the way we'd approach that. I'm just not sure about the question about committees' roles in improving grant monies. It would really, to me, in the context of a committee being a subcommittee of a board and the board being a part of those charged with governance, I could understand to some extent the involvement of the committee, but the word approve concerns me a little bit. Because approval is about aligned management executive function. Audit committees are typically there to oversight and review executive management decisions and controls. So to the extent they become enjoined in executive functions, it makes it a little bit difficult for the committees then to discharge their other role, I think. I can see another question. Should organisations be reporting inherent risk? Yes, I think they should. I think from this perspective, when we talk about inherent risk here, we're talking about the likelihood of a risk event, conditional circumstance coming into being and the consequences of it before we consider risk treatments. To me, it gives a much better set of information to the committee and to the executive to understand inherent risk, because it's those high inherent risks that you want to bring down to an acceptable risk level through your treatments. And there's always a cost-benefit trade-off, isn't there? Implementing a risk treatment costs something, and we're trying to balance the two. So, I think in terms of full disclosure and full understanding of the risk profile of the organisation, I would encourage when you're doing your risk assessments and talking about risk to have a sense of what the inherent risk is, and therefore, and then after the treatments are designed and implemented, what the residual risk is. How does VARGO deal with reputational and political risk in the context of public entities related to? Okay, well, yeah, there's the elephant in the room, isn't there? Because what I haven't said is, well, you might have a risk tolerance, and those in your authorising environment might not have a risk tolerance that's the same as yours. And obviously, the Audit Office is one part of your authorising environment. And what I'm trying to say to you today is we're happy to have a much more nuanced conversation about risk and innovation. You need to obviously have those conversations with ministers, particularly, and try to understand their risk appetite, because they are obviously a key part of your authorising environment. So that's a tough one, and I wish you well in your conversations with ministers.